first thing I want to start off by explaining one simple fact of nature. Things look different if you look at it from one direction as opposed to looking at it from another direction, right? I mean, you walk around a building, you know, the south side looks different. You walk around the other side of the building, it looks different from that perspective. Well, the thing about education is it looks way different when you're looking up from underneath as opposed to when you're looking down from on top. And when you're looking, you know, for those of us who come from, you know, who don't come from money, you know, who come from a working class background, and, you know, we say, well, what do you want a school to do? I mean, what is the purpose of schooling in your opinion? Anybody? Educate. Right. You send kids to school to learn things, okay? But people who are on top of society looking down, they look at things differently, okay? They don't necessarily want you to learn that much, okay? They want the schools to sort people. And they want to sort people so that they can maintain the same kind of social structure that they have now. And they want the rich people's kids to go to Harvard University or some other fancy school like that. And, you know, they want to save a few spots for the, for strivers from the lower classes maybe. But, you know, they want working class people's kids to be working class people. They do not want your kids to climb out, you know, they do not want your kids to climb up the ladder. Trust me, they don't. They'll let a few, but they don't want that to be a general thing. And especially the upper middle class, they do not want your children to climb up and compete with their kids. They do not want this, okay? So when you're dealing with problems with education, that is the reality that you must face, okay? Now, the problems in education that I'm going to talk about today are very old. And the examples that I talk about in my book are mainly from either a couple thousand years ago or, you know, up to the early 20th century. And that's for two reasons. Number one, the dead cannot sue me for libel. And number two, the problems haven't changed and we need to learn from history, okay? Now, I went to the Nat Turner Memorial, and Chairman Larry Ham was saying about that there were many, many slave uprisings during the days of slavery. And he talked about, and the one that was ultimately successful was the Haitian Revolution. But there were other ones. Well, one of the ones that I talk about in this book was the Stono Rebellion, which took place in 1739 in South Carolina. Now, the slave owners were absolutely terrified that the slaves would rise up. And they were terrified of slave rebellions. They knew that they could be murdered in their beds. They knew that what goes around comes around, and they were afraid that it was going to come around. So they came up with, after the Stono Rebellion, in the immediate aftermath, they rounded up and killed as many people as they could find who participated in it. The second thing they did was pass a piece of legislation called the Negro Control Act.
What was it called?
The Negro Control Act.
The Negro Control Act.
Oh?
Okay. Now, one of the things that this law did, and I've read the text of the law, so it's really disturbing. One of the things that the law did was establish that any black person was an absolute and permanent slave. So this really codified the color law. Now, if you look back into earlier American history, the color line was, there were some people who were slaves, and there were white indentured servants and so forth, but there was a lot more solidarity between poor whites and the Africans they were bringing over. So they really had to establish these racial divisions. But in South Carolina, one of the ways they did this is every Negro person is an absolute and permanent slave. And every son or daughter of an enslaved woman was an absolute permanent slave. Yeah. So that was one provision of the law. Another provision of the law was that if you were an enslaved person, you could not leave your master's property without written permission signed. You had to have a permission slip signed by the owner or by the overseer or somebody. You could not. You had to have a pass, a written pass. Okay. You couldn't go anywhere off the property, but you couldn't leave the plantation without that. Now, this system of control would fall right to pieces if slaves could do what?
Read and write.
Read and write. Okay. Now, what was the other provision of this law? It became illegal to teach any black person to write. Or read, right. So now I learned about this early on when I read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and I quoted in the early part of the book. And I said, it says here, very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced me to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful, as well as unsafe, to teach a slave to read. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy.
Mr. Old, smart.
So that's it. Education ruins a slave. Now, this is not a new idea that education ruins a slave, because if you look back, you turn the clock, back to the ancient Rome, which was a slave society, heavily dependent on slavery, and there were slave rebellions, including the Spartacus rebellion, which was I think the 3rd servile. Okay.
Third, that's right, third.
And a lot of the psychological technology for controlling slaves was really thought through, developed, and written down in ancient Rome. So if you want to understand the psychology of the slave master and the slave, you would do well to read some classical literature. Okay. Now, one of the things that I read that really blew my mind was this description of the Roman philosopher Seneca, who was one of the theorists of how to keep slaves in line. And he wrote about there's different kinds of education for different kinds of people. Now, obviously, if you're a baker, you need to know how to bake. If you're a butcher, you need to know how to cut up animals. If you're a candlestick maker, you need to know how to make candlesticks, right? But he said that there were different kinds of education. There was a different kind of education that you provide to a free man as opposed to a slave. And when he talked about what they call the liberal arts, and he said, we call these the liberal arts because we consider them appropriate for free men, meaning as opposed to slaves. Homine libero digna sunt, appropriate for free men. So the other kinds of things were, among them were the servile arts. And remember, service means slave, and it gave rise to the word serf later on. So the servile arts were the things that you taught to slaves, and the mechanical arts are the things you taught to mechanici, or technical workers like butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, people who do that sort of thing, weaving, baking, all that kind of stuff. Those were the mechanical arts. Now, I don't want to knock the mechanical arts, and I certainly don't want to knock the servile arts, because if you have a society where nobody knows how to do those things, the people live like animals. Because the servile arts and the mechanical arts do set us apart from animals. But the liberal arts are what is appropriate for free people. And I argue very forcefully that we must teach the liberal arts to everyone in society if we want to have a democracy. Now this curriculum of the liberal arts for democracy was created. I mean, the subjects themselves have been in a process of development for quite some time. But the people in ancient Athens had put this together in a single curriculum that they called a well-rounded education. And their word for well-rounded education gave rise to our word encyclopedia. So what was in this well-rounded education were 7 basic subjects. They were 3 language arts and 4 arts of number, space, and time. The 3 language arts were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar is the study of how words are altered and combined to form meaningful sentences. Logic is the study of arguments. So whether does this set of facts support that conclusion? If you don't want to get good at being able to answer questions like that, you have to study logic. Rhetoric is the art of persuasive speech. So if you want to persuade intelligent people, you need to learn you need to learn logic before you study rhetoric. And if you are, even if you're in the audience, if you know, well, gee, that's a crappy argument, that makes no sense. You need to know logic and rhetoric to keep yourself from being led astray by somebody with a gift of gab. So then on the arts of number, space, and time, mathematics is the art of number, and you need that for accounting, right? You need to keep track of how much you have, how much you owe, and so forth. Geometry was the art of number and space. So, and this was developed to a high degree in Egypt. Egypt was called, the name Egypt meant the measured land. So they developed geometry to a higher.
What did it mean? Measured land.
Yeah. Now, I mean, this makes sense because people
Makes
develop.
a lot of sense.
People develop these kind of skills for very practical reasons. And Egypt had, what was the main feature, the main geological feature of natural feature?
The Nile.
Right, and what does the Nile do every year?
Floods.
Right, now, if you have people who have real estate and farms and lot lines and so forth, and the flood comes along every year, you're gonna have to redraw your lot lines on a regular basis. So that's why geometry was so important to the ancient Egyptians, very practical reasons. So you've got number, or mathematics is number, geometry is number in space, music is number in time. And then astronomy is number in space and time. Now, if you want to run a society of any size, you have to have these basic skills. You need accounting to keep track of, taxes. You need geometry to keep track of lot lines and property lines. Music is important, obviously, for public festivals, but it also has it has military use. If you have a big bunch of men and if you want to get them from one place to another, get them through a choke point, you have to teach them to march. That's the purpose of marching, to get large groups of men to move in an orderly fashion and to get them to work together as a unit. And astronomy, of course, is essential for making calendars. So those were the basic liberal arts. And now this basic liberal arts curriculum was, the Romans thought it was just the greatest thing, but for free people only. Now, during the Dark Ages, the liberal arts were suppressed because you didn't have situations like Athenian democracy or even like the Roman Republic, where a lot of elected officials were in charge of things. During the Dark Ages, people were being ruled by crowned heads. It was my way or the highway. There was not that much democratic process going on, so the liberal arts were suppressed. But then they started to come, the appreciation for them started to revive in the Renaissance. And in Italy, they came up with an extension of this liberal arts curriculum, which they called the humanities, the studies of humanity. And they included history, philosophy, literature, language, art. Now they developed the humanities, they developed it for exactly the same purpose that the ancient Athenians had put together the liberal arts curriculum. And that is to promote reasonable, productive, and pleasant conversations among members of the ruling class. Now, in a democracy, everybody is supposed to be a member of the ruling class because it's ruled by the people. So everybody should have a grounding in these subjects. Now, in my opinion, that's what public schooling should be, and that's what public schooling should do, is provide everybody with a grounding in these kind of subjects. Now, so when you have universal free public education, theoretically, you can have that happen. The problem is, how can you have universal free public education, but if you're looking down on the school system from on top, if you're one of these people who are so rich and powerful, you kind of, your will gets done, okay? How are you going to prevent ordinary people from getting this kind of an education through the public school? I mean, their parents are willing to pay the taxes to support it. But how can you prevent them from getting this through their public schools? And the way you do that is you tamper with how education is, you tamper with the kind of educational theories that are taught to the teachers. You tamper with the textbooks. Now, the classic way that they dumbed down education was to use a method of reading instruction that doesn't work. They actually decided that instead of doing the ABCs like Frederick Douglass was learning when he was a child, instead of learning the ABCs, you learn to sound out each letter. It's called phonics, right? So instead of that, what they decided to do was have people memorize whole words as shapes. And this was called sight word, or it's got many different names, the look and say method, the sight word method, and so forth. Now they knew, Horace Mann, the education reformer, he was the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. He had heard about this from Thomas Gallaudet, who had developed a school for the deaf, and Thomas Gallaudet said, well, deaf people can't hear, so they can't, children who are born deaf, how can they sound out words if they can't hear? So he just gave them whole words, just memorize that whole word as a shape. So you see D-O-G, dog. Now the problem with that is that English words do not have interesting or consistent shapes. If we were writing Chinese where it was a character that meant dog and looked always pretty much the same, it would be fine. But English words can be in lowercase or uppercase letters. They can be in cursive writing. They can be in all kinds of typeface. I mean, look at the back of the room. See that where the word Coca-Cola? Now, if you would learn Coca-Cola as a shape in Helvetica, you would never be able to read that. So this sight word method.
Helvetica is a font. It's
Yes,
a type
yes.
of writing.
Yeah. So if you had, this sight word method is a disaster. And when it was first tried, it was such a disaster that 31 school masters from Boston published a book to say that this was such a disaster that they tried to wipe it out. Oh, we've been fighting this battle ever since. So and it was brought back with a vengeance in the 20th century by the Rockefeller Foundation and by their front man John Dewey. So even though the Rockefeller Foundation had spent money to send a researcher named Samuel Orton out to Iowa to figure out why it was that they had this epidemic of kids who can't read. The public schools out there, they were having this epidemic of this word blindness. They called it congenital word blindness. They thought there was something wrong with the children's brains if they weren't learning to read.
And these were white children?
Did Iowa? They were white. And they couldn't read. I mean, here's all, they couldn't read. So Orton went out to Iowa, and what he found was the more sight words the kids were being taught before they got real instruction in phonics, the worse their reading problems were. So now the Rockefellers had paid for that research, and their own sons. John D. Rockefeller had six children. 4 of his kids went to the progressive school that was run by Columbia Teachers College. All 4 of them, including Nelson Rockefeller, ended up with serious problems with learning, serious problems with reading. And it was because of this sight word garbage. Now the use of the sight word method as a tool of political oppression, that was also clear from the beginning, because they were starting this. Let's use the sight word method in Massachusetts in the 1830s and 40s at the same time that they started to have factories. And the factories in particular, they had these textile factories in Lowell, Massachusetts. And the young women who worked there, they could all read and write. Massachusetts pioneered free public education with phonics. So all these girls could read, they called them the Lowell girls, but some of them, they could read, and they could read and write, and there was a Unitarian minister, troublemaker, who had a magazine where he published their writing by and for themselves. And so these girls started a labor movement because they weren't getting paid very much, the working conditions were poor. So they decided to use their reading and writing abilities to argue their case to the general public. They started a petition drive that reached clear to New Hampshire. So, you know, in this context, a method of education that we've dumbed down for kids in the public schools was just new to work. And it's been, I mean, that's what's been going on. So, you know, when we want to improve our schools, we really have to look hard at the curriculum. And that's mainly what I'm talking about. Yes, school funding is a problem. You know, a lot of these things are problems. We all know those problems. But what I want to draw people's attention to is curriculum. Are they using an effective method of learning to read? Once the kids learn to read, are they teaching the liberal arts in the communities? And, you know, if not, you know why? It's because those are the studies for good people, and they don't want your kids to be free.
Wow.
Yeah.